Okay, so it's 12 o'clock my time, and so I think we're going to go ahead and start, and there might be some more people that trickle in as you begin here in the first few minutes, and so we'll add them as they come. But thank y'all for joining for the second part of the webinar, Small Ruminant webinar series. Today we have Dr. Rocky Lemus from Mississippi State, and I'm really excited about the information and knowledge that he's going to share with his presentation. So, Dr. Lemus, if you want to kind of introduce yourself and talk about some of the things that you have going on in Starkville and what you do up there, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tyler. I appreciate the invitation. Like Tyler said, my name is Rocky Lemus. I'm the Extension Forage Specialist with Mississippi State University Extension Service, and I have a statewide responsibility for a different variety of livestock systems. I work a lot with the beef cattle industry, but also small ruminants, horses, and um, and dairy. My job focus mainly on understanding how we can introduce different forest systems into the state at different areas, but also how we can utilize those to be more efficient in grazing management. And one thing that I want to focus today on my presentation will be on how we can actually use biological control of parasites through forest selection, but also grazing management, because this is a problem that we see very often across the South, especially because of the environmental conditions that we have. We are in that semi-tropical environment, very hot and humid, so it provides the perfect environment, the perfect storm for seeing issues with parasites across most of the year. And I have a better understanding of this because I also raise Nubian dairy goats, so I'm very familiar with some of the issues that we had to face and how we tackle those by incorporating different forage systems and grazing management strategies to achieve that. So one thing that when we talk about forest selection and grazing management, we need to think about the reality of parasites as more ruminant and what that means. Most of you guys might be familiar with this, that sheep and goats are going to be more susceptible to internal parasites than we see with other livestock, like cattle, due to the grazing behavior, but also because tend to have a lower immunity system. One of the major issues that we usually focus on this is the barber pole or the Homungus contortus worm. We see a lot of symptoms this year in these pictures that I'm showing here, where we see some of those symptoms that the barber pole infection, which is anemia, bottle jaw, and you see the goat on the top. That was a farm that I visited last fall. But also we look at weight loss and part body score conditions. You can see also that based on FAMACHA score, this almost close to a 5. So treatment becomes a major issue in those cases. So we're trying to see how we can utilize grazing management and also genetic selection that can help minimize the impact of these parasites. I know that Dr. Rio is going to talk more about other ways to control parasite and how you can utilize different um, systems to assess parasite loads and in the next presentation on the next part of the webinar. But today we're going to just mention on that. Um, so what are the key management practices to reducing parasite loads in small ruminants? The first thing that we need to do is look at forage considerations. And when we're talking about forage considerations, making sure that we have a good forage system, a diverse forage system, but also that within that forage system, we incorporate what we call bioactive or anthematic forages. And those are forages that are going to be very high in tannin. And we'll talk about some of them later on. So basically, what we're doing is those bioactive forage is going to have what we call secondary plant metabolism of substances that are beneficial to animal health. It's going to actually try to minimize the production of eggs by some of the worms when they are into the rumen of the animal. And also they had to be cope with grazing management practices. And rotational grazing is going to be one of those. We're going to have to look at rotational grazing system with short grazing periods and longer rest periods between pastures, which was a little bit different that we see with cattle production. We also have to talk about strategic stock density. Sometimes we overgrazing, and that could be a problem where we're exposing those small ruminant, either sheep or goat, to a higher load of parasites on the pastures. And also grazing height. Management, avoiding that overgrazing, that's going to be very important, but also monitoring parasite levels through fecal counts and implementing targeted deworming strategies when necessary. And I know that Dr. Rio is going to talk about more about that later. So, so when we look at the diet selection of three ruminant species, in this case, goats, sheep, and cattle, and how they distribute throughout the growing season from spring, summer, fall, and winter, and what species that are selected. Here we have three species. We have woody species, shrub species, and grasses. What we see here is that usually, for example, goats are going to be more in that browsing system. So you see that in the spring they're gonna select grasses, but once it's getting to the summer, they're gonna select those woody species, and then once we move into the winter, you're gonna see those goats selecting those shrub species like a privet and other things that are still growing in the middle of the winter. That's not the case with sheep. Sheep is tend to be more grazers, so you can see here that the amount of percent of different vegetations that they use is mainly based on grazing system. It's spring very high, and then kind of changes into summer and autumn a little bit, but it then come back in the winter time. So very similar to what we see with cattle. Grazing as well with grasses. So we'll talk about later about mixed species grazing, but this is one of the cases where sometimes maybe sheep and cattle cannot go together because they're going to be competing, selecting for the same species, unless you do a more approach where those sheep are going to go ahead of the cattle and you can come in behind with the cattle to actually utilize the residual forage that's left by the sheep. Another thing that we need to think about when looking at how we can utilize forages to our advantage in those type of system is we want to have different pastures. And what you see in this graph here, and applies a lot to the southeast, is how these forage species are growing through the season. And you'll see that most of the cool season grasses like annual clovers, annual ryegrass, or tall fescue here in northern Louisiana, northern Mississippi, those are cool season grasses going to be more productive in the spring and then late in the fall, depending on also the methods of establishment, especially with the cool season annual grasses like ryegrass or oat or cedar rye. So one thing that we try to focus is be able to give those animals pasture diversity that cope with the grazing system, allows them to thrive and get the nutrition to be able to also counteract some of the issues we see with parasite loads. So it's important that we introduce improve or alternative forages. So we want to be able to introduce not only grasses but also legumes or summer annuals that can provide also a higher quality forage that will help with the nutritional status of the animals, but also they can help with the situations with parasite populations that are not as prolific. Also, how we establish in those, usually in a prepared seed bed for annual crops. We want to select crops that are taller, so the larva cannot utilize those because the larva is going to be in the lower part of the forage system. But also, like I mentioned before, we're going to make sure that we are selecting those bioactive or anthemitic forages that can provide a medicinal effect against parasite infestation. So when it comes to the nutritive value of forages, they're gonna change depending on how their growing cycle is, what the seasonality is, but also the species. Usually, annual grasses will have a higher nutritive value than perennial grasses. When I'm talking about perennial grasses, we're talking about Bahia grass, Bermuda grass versus annuals that could be like a pear millet, sorghum Sudan grasses, or sorghum Sudan hybrids, crabgrass. All of those will be in that category. And then we have also cool season versus warm season. Like I mentioned before, most of those warm season grasses are going to grow in the summer. They're going to peak in the middle of the summer, when cool season grasses are going to be more active from uh, late December to early May, depending on where are you at in the state. And then we have also the comparison then between grasses and legumes. Legumes are going to be higher in nutrient value due to the high protein content because they can actually fix their own nitrogen. And some broadleaf species like chicory, the brassicas might have better quality also than grasses. So all of this have an impact as you plan your grazing management and your strategic approach to rotational grazing as well. So we want to make sure that we have that pasture diversity as much as we can. So, and this slide, you can see it's a little bit busy, but I want to give you an idea of the number of different forages and legumes that we can grow in the southern United States. And these are very well adapted to most of the climate that we have. So we had the cool season annual legumes. There's a large number of them. Probably crimson clover is one of the most common that we find out there being planted. But there are other clovers, annual clovers like balanza clover and Brazilian clover, which I highly recommend to use because they are very late maturing clovers. That means that they stay in the pasture until May, June. One of the advantages that Brazilian and balanza clover have, and also with Persian, is that they are low blooming potential clovers. They tend to have a hollow stem, so that lowers the amount of moisture that you have in that plant, and also will help you with reduce bloating issues compared to other varieties that you see like arrowleaf clover or crimson clover or wall clover. So there's some advantage in utilizing those. The other thing is that usually we plant balanza over zinc clover, any of these annual clovers with annual ryegrass or some of the small grains like cereal rye or oats. One of the advantages that I like with the late maturing clovers is that most of these grasses, cool season grass, are going to have really good nutritive value from late December to almost early April. So the it mitigates the need for having a high quality legume in there. But after we start warming up, those grasses tend to decline on quality. They become more fibrous. That's when I want to have those clovers coming up and also compensating for the loss of quality that I have in my annual ryegrass and be able to maintain a more consistent diet and nutrition for those for the sheep and goat. Another thing is also we have a large number of annual summer legumes and are there that probably people sometimes don't think about. For soybeans, cowpeas, if you are in Louisiana, I don't know if you can use sun hemp in Mississippi. Sun hemp is considered noxious weed, so we cannot plant it or use it. But also you had the opportunity to include Cereus lespedeza or annual lespedeza. Another one that I really like to use is Alice clover. It's more like a little shrub with a very leafy material. It's not a true clover, but it's a legume that can fix a lot of nitrogen, but also have a high nutritive value for your small ruminants in the middle of the summer. And also partridge pea. Partridge peas we see that usually come in areas where you have CRP land, or you can plant it. One thing that I don't recommend partridge peas because the cost of seed for partridge pea is very, very, very high. And then we have also our traditional warm season grasses, both annuals and perennial. Dallas grass is pretty much found anywhere, native in some pastures. And then you have Bermuda grass, Bahia grass, crabgrass. And then our annuals will be also for sorghum, permalit, and sorghum Sudan hybrid. Remember, when dealing with goats, parasite becomes a major issue. So you're going to look for a species that are going to have more upright growth. So Bahia grass fits very well into the system, and sometimes we can incorporate some legumes in there, like a red clover, to mitigate some of the lower nutritive value that you see with Bahia grass, but also for sorghum, permalit, and sorghum Sudan hybrid fit into that system. I'm a big fan of using pearl millet over the other two for grazing small ruminants. And the reason for that, especially goats, is because goats tend to be more climbers. So every time that plant grows and the goats try to get the upper leaves, they're going to trample that. They're going to take that plant down and you start losing productivity. Pearl millet stays about 18 inches tall, very leafy, so allows them to grow to graze at their uh, almost their height. So minimizing any trampling and increasing the utilization of the forage much better. And then we have, like I mentioned before, we have all the cool season grasses that you can incorporate into your pasture system on a prepared seed bed. Probably ryegrass is going to be more popular. And then you have also cereal rye, triticale, oat, Oat, it fits very well for us early in the fall. If you have a prepared seed bed, you can get early grazing. Ryegrass is more productive January to May, and cereal rye is very drought and cold tolerant, so it can be planted also early in the fall and might be able to get early grazing. If you are in northern part of the state, then there's an opportunity probably to have some tall fescue in there that can help you also with the grazing system. Within the tall fescue, we have the Kentucky 31 and the five infected fescue, which can have some impact in cattle mainly. Sheep and goat tend to be a little bit more resistant to the endophyte issue and toxicity that we see with tall fescue. But also there are new cultivars in the market and species that are either novel endophyte, which means that they have an endophyte in there, but it's not toxic, or they have the endophyte-free varieties, which means that they have removed that endophyte toxicity. The issue with endophyte-free tall fescue is that it's not as persistent as the Kentucky 31 or the Nova endophyte varieties. So that's something that you have to keep in mind when looking at those. So as I mentioned before, one of the things that using forage species for parasite mitigation in small ruminant is be able to select forages that are very high in tannin. So what are tannins? Tannins basically, like I mentioned before, are a group of chemical compounds that are produced mainly by broadleaf forage plants, and that includes chicory or some clovers. Typically, grasses that are not going to have tannins. Probably sorghum is the only one that species of grasses that might have a significant concentration of tannins on that. And and one thing that is that tannins are found in those broadleaf plants adapted to warmer climates. So that's why you see that most of the tannin concentrations on the species that we recommend for parasite control are gonna be seen growing mainly in the summer, and that's when we also have most of the parasite being active. I think chicory is the only exception with that. That we can plant chicory in the fall. It's gonna be active in the spring all the way into the summer. But also within the tannins, we need to be careful too because all no tannins are created equal. There are usually two types of tannins, what we call the condensed tannins. That's the one that we try to recommend for species that can be utilized for reducing parasite loads. And we have the what we call hydrolyzable tannins. There's some species of legumes that might have hydrolyzable tannins. They have what we call phytoestrogens, like a alfalfa, red clover, or white clover, which doesn't provide a lot of benefit from the point of view of parasite reduction when they're grazing those systems. So what are the benefits and challenges that we find with tannins? Some of the benefits that we see, as I mentioned before, is going to be a parasite control. Um, Tannins can help control internal parasite, the small ruminants, bloat resistance. A lot of these tannins also can help prevent bloating by binding an excess plant protein and prevent the formation of foam that can cause bloat. That's something that we see with these legumes that are in the middle of the summer. Uh, and also with, if we look at meat quality, there have been some relationship also between grazing tannin containing legumes that can improve meat quality if you're looking at the meat aspect of small ruminants. So some of the challenges that we see is that some of these tannins also, when you have very high levels of condensed tannin, they can make the forage less digestible, so less palatable. So there might be some limitations on some of those, and we'll talk about some of those later on. But also breeding forages for having better tannin concentration is kind of challenging um, because those plants cannot have the right amount of tannin. They can be expressed across a wide range of environments and growth stages. So those have an impact. Soil types. Most plants that have high tannins are going to be found in soils that might have a lower fertility, a lower pH, and that's why Sericea lespedeza does very well in poor soil, especially in areas that you might have even wooded areas. You see that Sericea lespedeza thriving in those environments. Let's talk a little about Sericea lespedeza. If this is probably one of the most common um, summer perennial legumes that we have. Uh, that it can be used for parasite loss reduction. It can be used for grazing, but also can be used for hay production. I know a producer in South Carolina that does an excellent job on producing Sericea lespedeza hay and selling it in the market. So it does a good job with that, but you can use it also for grazing. Usually comes early spring and it stays all the way until the fall when we get a frost and you start to see that then those plants tend to die out, but they come back next year. So it has shown to have an effect on reducing parasite loads. Like I mentioned before, this legume can grow in low fertility as acid soils and actually have a very high concentration of tannins. About 18% of the herbage dry matter could be quantified as a tannin concentration in that system. Another one that we don't see very much use in the South, but it's another option, is Birdfoot trefoil. This is a legume that also contains not only tannin, but help minimize bloat, improve protein uptake, and also have environmental benefits in addition to just the antiparasitic effects. It's not going to be as high in tannin concentrations as you'll see with Sericea lespedeza, but in fertile soils with that well fertilized, you see about 2 to 3% of the dry matter. While in acidic soils, we see that tannin concentration can increase from about 8 to 11% of the dry matter content of the plant. The majority of the tannin concentration of the Birdfoot trefoil is going to be in the leaves. That's what we're going to find. You can see in the picture that it's a very leafy legume. But also, the tannin concentration can vary between different varieties of Birdfoot trefoil. There's a variety called Empire, which tend to be a lower tannin level than another variety called Upstart. So sometimes varieties can have an impact also on the tannin concentrations in how they can be utilized. Samfoin is another one that can be utilized for reducing parasite control. Most of the tannins also expressed on the leaves. You can see that you have that long stem, but have very leafy material along the stem. One thing that we see that concentrations can range all the way from 6 to 25% dry matter. The concentration is gonna depend on whether the plant is fresh or dry and how it's preserved as well. We see that usually a fresh samfoin has a higher concentration than dry, and also we see that the concentration might decrease as the plant starts to mature. That's something that is very important to keep in mind from the point of view of grazing management if you try to utilize this species as part of your rotational grazing system. Uh, it has been shown also that the condensed tannins in samfoin can inhibit the activity of some bacteria and fungi. So might be something that sometimes we need to be careful how much they get into if we impacting the bacteria population in the rumen as well. Cowpea is probably one that's very common to utilize in the South. Usually when we use cowpeas, we can introduce that with a pearl millet or a sorghum Sudan um, and utilize it that way for grazing. Um, the amount of tannin that you're going to find with cowpea is going to also depend on the type of variety or cultivar that you have. But we usually see that the concentration are not very high. The concentration tend to be much lower. Most of the concentration of tannin you're gonna find is in the seed coat of the actual seed, and the levels in the leaves are gonna be much lower. So from the point of view of utilizing as a anthemitic type of situation in the summer, might have less benefit than some of the other species. And also we have found is that some of the tannins on the cowpea can also act as an anti-nutritional factor by impacting protein digestion in the animal and by binding protein molecules in the rumen. So there are some things that sometimes we with the high tannin, we need to be very careful how they're utilized because can have other secondary effects on the animals as well. But using some type of grazing management, rotational grazing can also minimize the axis, and sometimes why that's why we put it in together with a grass, so there's a balance between the grass and the legume to be able to utilize some of the tannins and balance that system. Hairy indigo is one that is, I think, an excellent forage. I've done a lot of work with hairy indigo. Um, it can contain a relatively high concentration of tannins with levels above 10% of the dry matter. Um, the like we just see with sampling, the sac tannin concentration can change depending on the growth stage, the environmental condition, and also the plant variety that you're utilizing. So it's it's more like a little shrub type plant, but small ruminant love grazing on those as well. Another one is lab. Similar to cowpeas, what you're gonna find is that most of the notable levels of tannin are gonna found on the seed, while the leaf considered to have no tannin at all. Uh, so that kind of limit the utilization of lab as a possible antiemetic, but also have issues with reducing the nutrient digestibility for the animal. Another issue that I've noticed over the last 10 years of working with lab is that it's very hard to establish. You get a hit or miss every time you plant. You don't get a consistent establishment and germination. So, and the seed is not cheap. So, kind of have some limitation when it comes to try to use lab as a possible bioactive forage for your animals as well. This is one that I have been working for the last couple of years, and it's called Sesbania. Sesbania can reach about 8 to 12 inches in height. It looks like very similar to coffee beans, but it's not in the same family. And the one thing that the Sesbania has is that the leaves contain both condensed tannin and another compound called saponins. Um, they contain about 2 to 4% of dry matter and condensed tannin. Um, and one thing that we need to be careful is that when you feed in high percentages of Sesbania to ruminant, it can cause some reproductive irregularities. So we want to make sure usually that if I'm using Sesbania, I'm introducing that with some type of grasses. So there's a balance on that. Um, Also, we're seeing that there's some effect on the digestibility of proteins. So mixing and moderation is something that we recommend. Uh, Sesbania also can not only produce tannin, but as I mentioned, some saponin, flavonoids, and phenolic compounds that can also interfere with the energy generation mechanism of parasite and lead to their death. So there's some benefit from the point of view of utilizing Sesbania in that system. We just need to be careful how much we offer into the animal so it doesn't cause any issues with reproductive issues that might have impact later on your breeding season. Uh, this one that's becoming very popular in the US, and chicory is mainly used quite a bit in New Zealand, but in the US it's taking a lot of attention, especially in the South, to introduce it not only for small ruminant, but also it's being used quite a bit for cattle grazing because of the high nutritive value. Um, Even though it contains a relatively low amount of condensed tannins compared to other forage plants, it has a lot of benefits. One of the benefits of chicory is that it looks like plantain, but it's not in the same family. Um, Chicory can be planted in the fall. The seed is very small. You're looking about 2 pounds of chicory per acre. So the amount that you plant is very small, but it becomes very productive in the spring and the summer, and usually can stay in your pastures for 2 or 3 years before you start to see uh, a reduction on the stand. I put this out. This is really beautiful kind of lavender color uh, flowers in late spring as well if you let it go to maturity. Um, it can have the one thing that it does also is that also that in parasite control by the ability to bind proteins in the parasite digestive system. So help to hinder how their their development. So if the larvae cannot get to a full mature larvae, cannot produce eggs. And by doing that, we start reducing the egg population that animals might be shedding. So that's one of the advantages that you see with that. Also, chicory contain all the secondary metabolisms that can help with antiparasitic properties, such as uh, fecal, when the eggs start to develop, help to reduce the egg population as well. Like I mentioned before, there are other bioactive forages, but these forages are mainly uh, for other benefits that we see with the small ruminants, like alfalfa, red clover, and white clover. They can aid in reproduction, metabolism, immunological functions, and livestock growth and performance, but they have very little impact on the barber pole worms. So even though they're considered bioactive forages, from the point of view of parasite mitigation, their benefits is very limited. It's more from the nutrition point of view of the animal than anything else. So let's talk about, now that we talked about some of the 4 years and how they can fit into that system. Another important part of making sure that those 4 years are going to be uh, beneficial and going to have you some return on the investment, how you utilize, and you're going to have to be able to use some type of grazing management. And grazing management is going to be very essential. And, if we look at pastures in the south and when I do a lot of farm visits, what we see is that producers only have a large pasture, all the animals are there, they're actually going to the same area. That's how they're reinfecting themselves, because they tend to go to those areas that overgraze, where that new grass is coming up, it's high in nutrition, and they want to try to get that nutrition out of that, the new shoots that are coming up. So we need to think about grazing management and how what we can control to actually make it effective. So we need to think about timing, what time of the year we're going to be grazing those pastures, the frequencies, rest periods length, how long we're going to let them um, rest. Because one thing that, if you think about barber pole, usually their cycle is about 21 to 28 days, depending on environmental condition. So thinking about making sure that those pastures are rested more than that, to be able to reduce the reinfestation of the animals by going back into the same pasture. Duration, time in a specific area, and we'll talk about that because some of the larvae can be developed in about 4 or 5 days. So minimizing how long those are going to be in the pasture is going to be essential. And another thing is intensity. What is the stocking rate? How many animals per acre I can put in a pasture? And that's, I think, one of the limitations that we have sometimes, is that we do a lot of overgrazing and we're exposing those animals to that larvae by forcing them to graze at a lower height that we usually would like to. But also, when we talk about rotational grazing system, we're going from a large pasture to a pasture that's going to be divided in smaller paddock, and it's up to the producer then to decide, what paddock system design or idea I want to use, how many paddocks I want to have, how often I want to move those animals. That's going to be up to the producer. But when you're doing that, there are some things that you need to think about. If you only have a large pasture, you need to think about fencing. For example, temporary fencing may be needed for the smaller paddocks. Pastures should be square or rectangles. I like the square pastures because allows that water to be centrally located, where the animals are going to be coming from different areas of the pasture and grazing more uniformly. Usually when you do a rectangle, they're going to have to walk a little bit longer to get water, and that can impact your grazing management. And those fields can be subdivided using temporary fencing, such as poly wire or electric net fencing. So there are different systems out there that we can utilize for a small rumen. Water is very essential, making sure that each paddock needs have water access, unless you have a central laneway system that is used. Uh, Clean water, especially fresh water in the middle of the summer, I think it's very essential for small ruminants to be able to thrive. Shelter, depending on in some of the climates, having some shelter for the animals as well. And remember that when we talk about rotational grazing system, labor, more time and management may be required. And this is something that I usually had the dilemma with a lot of producers is that they say that I can't move animals every day. But I see a lot of producers that are making hay. And they spend a lot of time making hay in the winter, in the summertime, but also feeding that hay in the in the wintertime. So if you take in the amount of time that actually you have in that process versus training your animals to a rotational grazing system, probably in the long term you're gonna have less time invested in a rotational grazing system than any other hay production system or grazing management system that you try to utilize. The fence type selection, I think, is very important, and it depending also not only on the type of ruminants, small ruminant you have. Do you have sheep or do you have goats? Um, Goats tend to like to climb, so if you have net wire, probably it's going to be the beneficial. But also utilizing, you can utilize a system where you have a high tense wire, but it's electrified, and that's something that I have utilized a lot. I use a 5 strand electric fencing system on my goats, and that works very well. But also there are this portable netting fencing that if you don't have the opportunity to actually uh, subdivide a whole pasture, you can create a small paddocks at a time and move those animals from one side to the another using this portable netting system that can be electrified with a portable solar power system and allows that to happen over time. One thing that when we talk also about fencing is also making sure that you selecting the proper fencing, but also if you're using electric fence and making sure that your voltage for that electric fence is at least 4,000, 5,000 volts. Otherwise, the goats are going to get out of that system. Uh, when looking at portable solar net fencing, it's very important to know, what kind of wires you're using. And usually they have a bunch of numbers on them. Like, for example, here you have a 9, 35, 12, 330. So what that means that you have 9 horizontal wires. My fence is 30 inches in height. There are 12 inches vertical support of wires between those wires, and my roll is 230 feet long. So that helps also look at what you need to do. But also we're looking at high tensile permanent fence. Uh, it's also important to know that the resistance to electricity flow increases with wire size. So 12 gauge wire is a large wire, carries more charge than a 14 gauge wire, which is smaller. So selecting the right high tensile wire is going to be very important, but also, like I mentioned, ensuring that you have adequate voltage, more than 4,000 volt for sheep, and for goats, I will say at least 7,000 or more. So you need to think about using a good energizer with high impedance. Either that could be a solar energizer, or if you had the opportunity to tie it up to your barn, using a energizer that can be plugged into one of your outlets, might be more beneficial. I like the ones that I can plug in my outlet because I have a constant um, level of voltage going on. I don't have to worry about shade and my portable solar going down or something like that. So, and making sure that you have enough ground rods on the ground to actually be able to make that contact and have a good um, flow of energy throughout the fence as well. So when it comes to rotational grazing, like I mentioned before, is making pasture into smaller paddocks so that they can support the desirable stocking rate and move animals to a new paddock regularly. So this might help to reduce the parasite pressure, but also will help removing the animal before the parasite eggs hatch and the larvae are ingested. So there's also important to think about when doing a rotational grazing is how I'm going to move my animals, because we want to make sure that the animals are getting the better nutrition in those systems. So I usually like to be able to look at the animals by groups and be able to move them from one pasture to another. For example, I like to be able to put the young, recently weaned animals first, let it get that nutrition. Then I go to the lactating or pregnant animals, and then the dry animals will be the last going into that rotation. So it's up to the producer determining those groups and be able to establish how those rotations might work for them. When I'm talking about rotational grazing, another thing that is very important when setting your paddocks is be able to look at how long I'm going to be grazing those paddocks. Because if you look at the limit time, the amount of time that takes those eggs to hatch, depends on temperature and moisture conditions. In the south, because our temperature and moisture conditions, we're probably going to see those eggs hatching faster than some people in the north. So the complete life cycle of the barber pole can take between 3 and 6 weeks. The time an egg drop to larvae hatching is only 4 to 5 days. So what I want to make sure is that allowing the livestock to graze in paddocks for 3 or 4 days. I want to make sure that my rotations are shorter, and then I'm going to move it to a different pasture. That will minimize the opportunity for those eggs that are hatching, then that larvae infesting my animals and continue doing that. So most animals are going to be moved to a new pasture every 4 days if you are in a warm and wet environment, and every 7 days if you're in a cool, dry environment, or whenever the forages are less than 3 inches. So we want to make sure that grazing height is going to be very important in that. So we talk about stocking density management, and that's do not overstock over graze. So one thing that we want to make sure is that we put in the correct number of animals in that system to be able to reduce uh, overgrazing that's going to expose those animals to greater fecal contamination. So our rule is usually about 6 goats or sheep per acre, and you can adjust those depending on the quality of the pastures and the weather conditions. As you look at this table that you have to your right, what you see here is give you what the pasture quality is and how many goats I can put in there. So if I got a low quality pasture system, then I'm probably going to be able to support only 2 to 4 goats, 1 to 2 sheep, and about half a cow. If I'm looking at a low quality brush browse system, goats might be a little bit higher because there are more browsers, so 5 to 7 animals in there. With the sheep, 3 to 4, the cows probably stay the same. When I have a good quality pasture, then I can increase those to about 6 to 8 goats, 5 to 6 sheep, and the cow will go up to about 1 head per acre. And this thing happen when you have a good quality brush bow system. You can really incorporate more goats into that system, and the sheep pretty much stay the same because they are not that great of browsers compared to goats. So I'll give you an advantage in those systems depending on what you have. And when I'm talking about good quality brush browse system, I'm talking there's a lot of plants that can browse, but also have access to a good grazing system as well. That also has to do with the forage rest periods. And usually the rest period is very important when you move the animals out of the paddock. And the reason for that is because remember, you're trying to break down that parasite cycle, that 21 to 28 days cycle depending on environmental conditions. So those rest periods become very crucial. So we want to make sure that we're allowing that forage to recover, have enough growth, that when the animals go back in there, they are not really overgrazing that system. And then depending on weather conditions, the rest periods of forages can also change quite a bit. And most of the recommendations are that if you go cool season grasses like annual ryegrass, small grains, tall fescue, and they're growing in cool weather, the recovery is going to be much faster. We're looking at 10 to 14 days versus then hot weather like in late May already, might be 35 to 50 days. The opposite happens when we look at warm season grasses. They're going to grow mainly in the summer. So when they're in cool weather, their growth is going to be delayed 35, 40 days. That's why you see that those Bahia grass, Bermuda grass takes a little bit more to come up early in the spring, or once they do, they reach June, they're going to be very productive. And again, when we get to late fall, they slow down on their growth because of those cooler temperatures. But in the middle of summer, you have about a recovery of about 15 to 21 days. With legumes, alfalfa, clovers within cool weather, it's about 21, 28 days, and hot weather will be about 30 to 40 days. But with that said, one thing that we need to do is that we need to think also that rest periods are not dependent on a calendar, but more in a plant recovery. And also how much you grazing and what kind of grazing pressure you're doing in there. So they should depend on weather, on intensity of the grazing event, health and size of the root system, and plant composition of the pasture. Uh, One thing that we need to think about is, if we are overstock and we're removing too much biomass, above ground biomass, what we're doing is also we're shrinking that root system. Every time that we overgraze a pasture, that plant doesn't have enough nutrients to come back and regrowth. So what it's doing is taking nutrients out of the root system to be able to regrowth that top. And if we keep grazing it, overgrazing it, what happens is that root system starts to shrink. And the more we shrink that root system, the longer it's gonna have to recover. So eventually, if we continue overgrazing, what happens is you're gonna see areas on your pasture where you're gonna have empty spots, and then you see the inclusion of weeds because weeds become more opportunistic. Some weeds might be grazed by small ruminants, some which might not. I think there is a misconception that small ruminants will eat any weeds that are out there, especially goats, and that's not usually the case. But also, we need to be careful that some of those weeds might be toxic to the animal. So there's some detrimental effect when we don't allow the plants to have a good rest period and we overgraze in those pastures. That can be detrimental in the long term. Grazing management height is very important, and that's also because of the growth of the how the parasite and the larvae are going to develop on those pastures. So we want to make sure that when we are grazing a pasture, that we're leaving at least 4 inches of forage in the field because most of the parasite larvae that you're going to find is going to be in the lower 2 inches of those pastures. So we want to minimize the exposure of the goat and the sheep to that larvae. So at 4 inches will be beneficial. And these grazing sticks are really good, especially if you're doing a rotational grazing system, to know what was my grazing height when I started it, and I can monitor what is the grazing height that I need to think about taking those animals out. So I give you a tool to actually monitor your pastures more closely and be able to utilize that to uh, to your advantage to make sure that you're minimizing the exposure of the animals to the parasite larvae. Another thing that is very important is when selecting species, I like to select species that are upright in growth instead of prostate lateral growth. Bahia grass is one of those that grows very upright. Bermuda grass tend to grow more laterally. So you put these runners on the ground. So choosing species that give you that benefit might be also to consider. And sometimes we might move the animals out of the pasture, but we realize that if we are not doing a mixed grazing species system where I can bring animals behind it, I'm gonna have to consider mowing or topping those pastures to remove any excess herbage and the parasite eggs. So there are some things that you need to consider from that point of view. Another thing will be ideal also sometimes is you can consider using mixed grazing species. Uh, this is something that is very common and that we can utilize very, very well in the South. Um, Cattle is a good option for looking at introducing small ruminants and cattle together. Horses, on the other hand, tend to overgraze and more spot grazers. So, goat and horses sometimes is something that might you not want to put in together. Probably sheep and a horse might be something you can do, but I will let the sheep graze first, and then follow with the horses. The same thing approach that I do when I have um, sheep and cattle. Sheep, I trying to let it go. I call lead the the leader follower system, where the sheep goes first, because sheep is what we call top grazer. They like to graze the top of the plant because of more nutrition and move on. So if I can do that, then I can bring the cattle behind it and let it graze the residue that was laid by the sheep. Another thing that is very important is that when we're grazing the livestock in there, they utilizing the parasite that the barberpole does not thrive in the rumen of the cattle. So basically, you actually breaking that cycle of the parasite that is also in those pastures as well. So, but also using a species that serve the same purpose. So that allows you to actually be able to achieve the goal better for better utilization of your pasture, but also with different forage types and also improve weed control. By keeping that system, we maintain a better system also to avoid weeds being more invasive. Another thing that I like to use, and I would call it, I would classify this as biological, but it's something that I will not do every year. It's something that probably I'll do every 2 or 3 years if I have enough biomass to do this. It's doing a prescribed burning. What we're doing with a prescribed burning is sometimes when pastures have a lot of biomass accumulation, this can decrease this residue for winter parasite survival. One thing that parasites sometimes can go dormant in the wintertime, either in the pasture, but or they can go either dormant in the rumen of the animal until the environmental conditions are correct for them to thrive in that environment. So so using a prescribed burning can be an option. Usually, most of these prescribed burning will be done in late winter, early spring. I will always recommend that if you decide to do a prescribed burning in your pastures, that you have a burn permit and you work with your county forestry association to make sure that you have a burn manager on site that knows what it's doing and be able to do it correctly and avoid any issues with fire escaping your property and causing damage to adjacent properties or other issues. So always protect yourself by having a permit, but also consulting with your forestry association to have a burn manager that can provide some assistance when doing that as well. So there are some indicators I think that we cover species, we cover grazing management, but there are some indicators that you have to consider as a producer. And one of those is become a student of your pasture. Get to learn what you have in your pasture, get to learn how your animals are grazing and how you can utilize that to the advantage. I like to use the phrase boots on the ground, eyes down, so I can actually see what's happening. I see a lot of producers that look at their pasture from their window of their vehicle. That's not a good way to be able to assess the pasture. Get out there, look at what is in the pasture, what is coming up, what is not coming up, what is disappearing. So, so be able to observe what is your plant diversity, is the ground cover, what the grace area 2 weeks ago looks like, a month ago from now. It gives you a better advantage of how you can utilize your grazing system to your advantage and also minimize the issues with parasite. How much biomass is left after each rotation? That's where that grazing stick becomes a good tool, because I can go in there and try to estimate the height and how much I have, and then come back at the end after I move the animals and see how efficient I'm going to be in removing the amount of biomass that I want them to remove. Keep records during rotation and observation. I think that's very important. So you know what pasture might be ready to be grazed next time, but also allows you to see how your pasture composition and your pasture response vary from year to year, and give you a better idea how down the road you'll be able to manage those pastures better. And also compare farmage score before and after implementing a rotational grazing system. That's another thing that you can utilize to be able to check, how good a job I'm doing with my grazing system to minimize the exposure of my animals to the barberpole larvae. And sometimes if you see that FAMACHA score is improving over the season and improving every year, it's because probably you're doing a good job then with your rotations as well. So with that, there are some final considerations that you have to take into account. Climate and parasite species. Adapt grazing species strategies based on the prevalent parasite species in your region and how they're influenced by climate. Remember, in the south, probably we're going to have higher rates of barber pole, shorter window for them to uh, reach the larvae stage than somebody in the north. Uh, Pasture quality is also very important. That not only for maintaining a consistent grazing pressure and good nutrition, but also be able to allow those animals to graze what they need and be able to rotate and allow those pastures to recover very quickly. Uh, Incorporate bioactive forages as part of the pasture management, either as a monoculture or mixed forage species. There are some of them that can be incorporated as a monoculture. Alice clover is one example of those that probably does very well as a monoculture, Sericea lespedeza, but other species might be incorporated with some type of annual grass or even into your perennial systems, warm season grass like Bahia grass or Bermuda grass, where I can incorporate chicory. That's another thing to consider. Animal selection. I think this is something that is very important too. Considering breeding for parasite resistant traits within your flock or using mixed grazing species to break down those parasite cycles. That's something that is crucial as well. So the final message is that there's not a silver bullet species for a grazing system. So not only one single species is going to be adapted to the entire farm, nor it will provide satisfactory production throughout the year. So it's very important that you have some type of pasture diversity or utilize different forages across different times of the year to achieve what you want to do. So so you want to make sure that you choose species that are adapted to your climate, your soil conditions. It can also have persistent on the grazing pressure. And one thing is also make sure that those species are going to have a long-term persistence. That's the whole point of a rotational grazing system is make sure that those species are there for a long time as well. That we providing them with the opportunity for them to recover and be able to be productive for a long time. And we want to be able to use that control over sensory grazing system practices that fit your needs to optimize pasture utilization and also decrease issues with parasite loads. So with that, this is my contact information. If later on you think of something that we didn't discuss on this in the webinar or we discussed and you have questions, please feel free to reach me. We have we're in Facebook on Mississippi Forages or in Twitter on X now. Or you can email me directly, call me. I'll be more than happy to see how I can help you with any information and or management advices that might help you on your farm. Um, with that, I'll be happy to take any questions.
Well, I don't see any in the question and answer or the chat. But Dr. Lemus, thank you so much for putting this presentation together and coming on our webinar here. I thought you shared a lot of great information about grazing strategies and grazing techniques, and I really enjoyed your few slides that you talked about overgrazing. I think that's not only important with small ruminants, but cattle, horses, whatever else, any other kind of livestock system. And I really think that that's a message that a lot of people can utilize and hear and use across the Southeast and the Gulf Coast region in general. Like I said, thank you. It was great. And so, like always, this will be posted to our YouTube channel, LSU AgCenter Livestock, here in the coming weeks. I'm available. My email is tbarlow@agcenter.lsu.edu, and then Dr. Lemus's contact as well. He's filled with a lot of great, useful information. And so, thank you, Dr. Lemus, for jumping on and doing this presentation for us.
You're welcome. Thank you for the opportunity.
Absolutely. We'll have our next Parasite Pursuit webinar on March the 7th with Dr. Layla Rios from Mississippi State as well. And she's going to be talking more about strategies for control on more of the chemical side, chemical methods. And so I'm looking forward to that as well. But With that, thank you again, and I look forward to hearing you down the line.
Thank you.